this is Diana McField. She is
Nice.
XYZ.
Yeah. We're gonna have more seats than people. Are we?
So probably.
Still panels coming in person, right?
In person, all four?
Isn't it, Fahim Abed is actually here.
Uh-huh.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, it's the roll on. Okay. So you get a lot of feedback if you have the audio on,
through the
but
mouse.
I would
Is it
just check like every 10
Oh,
minutes.
nice. Four in person.
Okay.
Four in
It's a
person.
little tight.
The Zoom thing.
Perfect. Do we want to try to get 4 chairs that match?
No, then that's kind of what we have.
Okay. Should we put these out?
Yeah, I was just a moderator in the middle.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Do we have the water bottles for them?
Yes, but we only have 4.
We're going to get started shortly. Give us one more minute to get everything settled out, and then we will get started with our program soon. But thank you all so much for showing up tonight, and we're so excited to be kicking off of our symposium soon. Camera. Other way. Hi, my name is Carolina, and I'm one of the student leaders of this symposium and of the IGL at Tisch College, and I'm so excited to be here tonight with you all. We're going to begin with some opening remarks from Dean McField of the Tisch College. So welcome, Dean McField.
Good evening, everyone. I will try to project my voice today to make sure everyone can hear me, but my name is Tiny McField, and I want to just welcome everyone. I am the Associate Dean for Strategy at Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts University, and also thank you for braving the weather. It is a packed room in here, and we are excited to launch this event today. I also want to thank all of the student leaders and staff who helped put the program together today. We appreciate all of the hard work that has gone into today's programming and the entire symposium. And we also want to say thank you to the guests, the panelists, for the remarkable work that you're doing and for launching our symposium today. Most of all, we want to thank all of the students for their leadership in collaboration with Tisch College and the fellow students. Your leadership is the reason why important events like this today take place here at Tufts University. We want to also say that as we continue our work today to integrate the programs and events previously supported by the Institute for Global Leadership, we continue to do so with the voices and student experiences prioritized at the forefront so that we can move forward in this endeavor together. At Tisch College, we are focused on building robust, inclusive democracy for an increasingly multiracial society. We are here today and over the next few days to discuss an issue of grave importance to health and security of robust democracy here in the United States and democracies around the world. Today, we're here to discuss the press. A free press is vital for a functioning and flourishing society. We can say that, and it sounds good and it sounds necessary, but what does it really mean? How does it materialize? What does a free press look like in support of a robust and inclusive democracy? And what are the ramifications when a vital and free press is threatened? That's what you all are exploring over the next few days. And this could not come at a better time. Because across the world, the right to report the news in all forms is under attack. Members of the press increasingly face threats, physical, legal, and more importantly, the work that they do, the critical job of informing citizenry, is under attack. We are seeing violent attacks on journalists by extremists, both as individuals and governments. Deliberate attacks of misinformation seeking to undermine our democratic institutions. And campaigns to silence those who report on subjects considered controversial or taboo. We have seen the effects that the deterioration of press freedoms has on journalists and the publics they serve. We must ensure that our right to information and to freely disseminate the information is protected, because we know that the key to a civically engaged public is education. On behalf of Tisch College, I want to thank all of the journalists and activists from around the world who are joining us for this symposium, both in person today and virtually. We value your work, and we are grateful for the sacrifices that you and those of your family members make each day. We appreciate your insights as we work to preserve and protect freedom of the press. Much like our own students who are here to learn from you and with you, your commitment and dedication give us hope for the future. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I'm looking forward to this important and informative conversation.
Good evening all. My name is Gauri Kashyap. I'm a junior here at Tufts University and the co-president of the South Asian Regional Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our first international symposium on preserving and promoting freedom of the press hosted by the student groups under the IGL, now under Tisch College. Every year, the World Press Freedom Map gets darker. Reporters Without Borders does an annual press freedom index, which assesses the state of journalism in 180 countries. An analysis of the 2022 index reveals a stark increase in polarization exacerbated by misinformation. Journalists today are under attack for doing their duty of defending the liberty of the people, for doing their duty in protecting the integrity of democracy all over the world. A free and independent press is at the center of our international system, and if not maintained, poses a grave danger of biased and one-sided information. Over the course of this symposium, we will analyze this trend to gain greater insight into misinformation, journalism under authoritarian regimes, journalism in war and occupation, and women in journalism. All these panels will be live streamed on JumboCast. Our panelists today are all impressively accomplished, and I want to thank them for joining us today. These conversations will leave you thinking critically about these issues. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to your participation. I want to now welcome my colleague Emma to introduce our panel.
Thank you to Gauri and Dean McField for those introductions. Hi everyone, and welcome to the first panel of our symposium. My name is Emma Jennings. I'm a junior studying international relations here at Tufts, and I'm involved with the IGL through Oslo Scholars and the Middle East Research Group. This panel, Freedom in the Press Under Authoritarian Regimes, is very salient for our current moment, as journalists around the world are being attacked, repressed, and imprisoned for wars that would bend it to fit their own narratives, whether those are autocrats, CEOs, or democratically elected officials. As press freedoms are becoming increasingly restricted around the world and media polarization increases, we are left wondering what the future of free, unbiased reporting will look like. Here to discuss these important issues are Sharif Mansour, who's on Zoom, David Moss, Adefemi Akinsanya, Olga Cherakova, Fahim Abed, and our last panelist cannot be here tonight, and we'll have a brief explanation why in a moment. Each will give a few opening remarks before we get into the panel discussion, and after the panel, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Please keep your questions directed at one panelist and under a minute. Thank you again for coming, and please join us after the panel for refreshments from Noor Mediterranean. So briefly, Rana Ayub, our last panelist, could not join us tonight because the Indian government has pressed charges against her. Here to introduce Rana and give a statement on her behalf is Priya Mota, a member of the South Asian Regional Committee.
So as Emma just mentioned, the last speaker who is supposed to be here today is Rana Ayub. Rana is a prominent Indian journalist who has worked as a freelance journalist as well as a columnist for the Washington Post. And she's also the author of the Gujarat Files, Anatomy of a Cover-Up, which details the aftermath of the 2002 Gujarat riots and the roles of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his close associate Amit Shah in a number of extrajudicial killings of Gujarati Muslims. Rana has been one of Prime Minister Modi's most prominent critics and has played an instrumental role in the defense of press freedom in an increasingly autocratic nation. Unfortunately, earlier today, as Emma mentioned, Rana received the news that the government of India had formally filed charges against her and was thus unable to attend today's panels. Before I go any further, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I am an Indian Hindu who directly benefits from the systems and the forces that Rana has worked so tirelessly to combat and that have equally tirelessly worked to persecute and silence her. I am deeply saddened that she could not be here today to speak for herself, and as I could never do her words justice. Nevertheless, I'll do my best The following is on a statement which she released on Twitter when the news broke earlier this morning. She tweeted, "My pen can never be silenced. Ironic that I conducted a seminar yesterday here in the US on the attack on the free press in India. I will continue to raise my voice against the persecution of the marginalized in the country. My statement, all I have to say," and her statement is below, and it says, "I have learned from media reports that the ED, which is the Directorate, the Electoral Directorate of Enforcement in India, has filed a charge sheet in the PMLA case. PMLA stands for Prevention of Money Laundering Act, initiated against me. It is noteworthy that the ED has provisionally attached my bank account funds, including my professional income, but the attachment proceedings were stayed by the Delhi High Court, and the attachment of funds has not been confirmed. The funds raised by me for COVID support were raised and used with the sole aim of helping people in dire need, and I'm happy that many families ravaged by COVID receive support. The charge sheet filed by the ED is yet another desperate attempt to target and intimidate me for my work, and yet another example of the abuse of PMLA law and misuse of law enforcement agencies to silence me, a voice that questions and critiques the ruling regime. I am confident that this abusive process by the ED will not withstand judicial scrutiny. I, too, will not be deterred from performing my role as a journalist. Rana is a symbol of revolution in India, a fierce defender of freedom, justice, and human rights, and an inspiration to young people across the country, including myself. She has been terrorized by the government and people of India alike. And on behalf of all the students at the IGL, I would like to express our unequivocal support for Rana and her work, and our equally unequivocal condemnation for the Indian government's merciless persecution of her. Rana, if you watch this, we are so grateful for your contributions to our society, and we stand firmly with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ria. To introduce our other panelists, first we have Sharif Mansour, who is the Middle East and North Africa Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists. He is an Egyptian-American democracy and human rights activist who co-founded the Egyptian Association for Change, a nonprofit that mobilizes Egyptians in the U.S. to support democracy and human rights in Egypt. In 2004, he was honored by the Al-Khulema Center for Human Rights in his work in defending freedom of expression in Egypt, and was named one of the top 99 young foreign policy professionals in 2013 by the Diplomatic Courier. He is also a Fletcher alum and received his master's in international relations in 2007. Welcome back, and we're looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for showing the team. I hope you can hear me well. There is
1 second. Oh,
a few things I want to talk about.
sorry.
See what-
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I
Can you pause 1 second? We're trying to get your volume to the room.
sure.
We will come back to you. I'm so sorry. Next on our panel is David Moss, who is the director of the International Journalists Network at the International Center for Journalists. IJNet covers global journalism trends and produces resources for journalists around the world. He has worked in research, reporting, and international development, including as a local politics reporter and deputy editor at Al Dia, a Spanish-English news outlet in Philadelphia, and as a journalist in Colombia for the news site Colombia Reports. Before transitioning to journalism, he also spent several years managing USAID-funded programs across Latin America, Colombia, Honduras, and Paraguay. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I graduated from Tufts in 2012, so it's nice to be back. So yes, I work at the International Center for Journalists now, where I'm the director of IJNet. IJNet is a multilingual publication. We publish in 8 languages, and our audience is really journalists around the world. And because we publish in 8 languages, we really have a truly global reach. And the idea is to really support journalists, put out resources to help them with their reporting, and unfortunately, increasingly, more and more, this means putting out resources to help journalists navigate increasingly anti-democratic environments and authoritarian contexts. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Next up, we have Artemia Akinsanya, who's an international correspondent and anchor for Arise News in Lagos, Nigeria. She has covered topics including police brutality, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Nigerian population, and business and economic development. In October 2021, she was assaulted live on air by the Nigerian police while covering the anniversary of the End SARS anti-police brutality protests. She is currently a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and has previously worked for Al Jazeera, TRT World, and Reuters. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. First and foremost, thank you for pronouncing my name so well. Appreciate it. As she said, my name is Adefemi Akinsoya. I am a Nigerian journalist, and I have been doing this work for the past 8 years. And for the vast majority of those 8 years, it has been quite peaceful, to say the least. I've worked in different countries, but the first time I experienced a deteriorating press freedom was at my stint at TRT World, which is the Turkish broadcaster. It was their English-speaking broadcaster. And that was quite a momentous moment. It was the first time that they had started up their English-speaking outfit, and they brought journalists from around the world to help them do that job. However, in July 2015, it was a very normal day in the newsroom, as many people would, as many of my colleagues here can imagine, and the Turkish military came into the newsroom, booted their way through the glass panels and took the channel off air, took mobile phones off journalists. And though the coup attempt was put down before the next day, it was the first time you're able to realize how important the press is, and clearly it must be important for governments to want to suppress it so dangerously. If I leapfrog to my time in Nigeria, back at Arise, again, the coverage of the End SARS protests was something that you couldn't run away from because it was such a huge story in Nigeria at the time. SARS stands for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which was a faction of the Nigerian police, which over the years had a terrible reputation of actually being a criminal outfit rather than being the outfit that seeks to tackle criminals. And so what we saw in 2020 was Nigerian people finally saying enough is enough and wanting to stop this. And unfortunately, the coverage of that protest throughout 2020 and onwards into 2021, when we look at the memorial of the 20th of October, it's still quite heartbreaking, difficult to talk about, because when you have protests, whether they're big or small, online or in person, they seek to change things for the better. And unfortunately, what we saw in Nigeria at that time was a government who, unfortunately, to say that again, seeks to promote democracy in a very authoritarian way. So if you believe in true democracy, you truly believe the power is with the people. When the people say they are unhappy, there's a duty to respond to that unhappiness with accurate and fitting alternatives. Instead, unfortunately, those calls for change were met with violence and murder. So when we look at deteriorating press freedom in Nigeria, it's quite complex because people still go about their business as journalists, and they continue to do that against the backdrop of a continuing threat. And I speak to you from somewhat a position of privilege. I work in television. It's a small network where the owner is quite well connected, but that didn't obviously protect us from being attacked by the police. I say all of that to say there's a huge problem when it comes to press freedom in Nigeria. By all definitions, it is deteriorating across a plethora of indices, and there is work that is continuing to be done to solve these issues. And we can only hope that when we come to an axis like an election, Nigeria is going to the polls in February 2023, that not only will that election be able to be covered without the threat of police violence, that it will be the first step into a country that truly seeks to reflect the democracy it says it believes in.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Olga Churakova, who is an independent Russian journalist and podcast host who covers political developments in Russia. She previously worked for the investigative journalist outfits iStories and The Project, where she covered topics like corruption, internal Russian policies, and protests in Belarus. In July 2021, she was labeled a foreign agent by the Russian government, and they banned The Project's work. This prompted her to start her podcast, Hi, You're a Foreign Agent, which received the Medusa Award for Best Podcast in Russian and has been included in the selection of Best 24 Media Podcast since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She has also been shortlisted for the European Press Prize for her work Master and Chef about Russia's presence in Libya. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with you, and thank you for the interest to all of us. And I was banned as a foreign agent a year ago in 2021, and my number was lucky number. I was 25 in this list of foreign agents, and now after a year we have in this list like almost 200 journalists and almost 50 organizations, activists, including lawyers and so on. Things get worse and worse. And yeah, I want to hear all your questions today.
Thank you. Now we have Fahim Abed, who was a local reporter for the New York Times in Afghanistan until the Taliban takeover in August 2021, when he and his colleagues were evacuated from Kabul and relocated to the U.S. He was also a member of the New York Times team that won an Overseas Press Award for coverage of Afghanistan. And he is a 2019 alum of the East-West Center's Fellowship Program and an Afghanistan Observatory Scholar with New America. He currently works as a visual journalist for the Tribune Review in Pittsburgh and is also Dean Fellow at Harvard.
My name is Fahim Abed. I'm happy to be here. I'm an Afghan journalist. I have been doing and covering Afghanistan for the past 12 years, and now with the Taliban regime in control of Afghanistan, it's not possible to do journalism from within Afghanistan, and most of our colleagues are covering it from outside Afghanistan and with the information we get from within the country. Unfortunately, like many other countries, situation in Afghanistan is very bad for journalists. After the collapse of the government for the first year, Taliban were at least nice to foreign and international journalists, but now it's getting much harder for them to write stories about Afghanistan and to operate in Afghanistan. So the only hope is those journalists who are trying to cover the country from outside, and the Taliban are completely against media. They don't want journalists to cover, and they don't want them to work there. Yeah, looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the audio working?
Yeah, I think so.
Sharif, do you want to give it another go?
Yes, can you hear me now?
One sec. Sorry. Sorry, it's more complicated than they make it seem. Sorry about that.
This first
Is there anyone here that knows how to do this? Any of the IT people in the back?
It sounds like it comes from
You want to try? Yes.
Yeah, maybe. It's going to be a reverb though. Because then they say you need the passcode. Microphone. These are the different speakers, and then if you tap different ones, it tells you you need a passcode, but then it doesn't. Oh, is it 207?
What is it? Sorry, 1 second. Other thing I would say. Did you figure it out?
70207. What is it?
702.
Wrong password. I would say, Emma, I would say just go ahead. Well,
Okay, so we're just gonna move ahead with the main panel questions and then hopefully get this figured out at some point during. So the first question that we have for the panelists is the 2022 World Press Freedoms Report, which Gauri talked a little bit about in her introduction, has blamed growing global polarization on the spread of opinion media and an unregulated online information space. In what ways does this spread of opinion reporting and other forms of irresponsible journalism help rather than hinder authoritarians around the world? Let's just start.
Helps authoritarian regimes because the information is curated. It doesn't seek to first and foremost tell an objective truth. It seeks to tell a subjective truth. It seeks to tell a truth with an agenda. So when you are building or benefiting from an authoritarian regime, it's easier to do that when you have an information that you can control and an information that seeks to align with your own agenda and your own morals. With the coming of opinion journalism, though it does have quite a negative connotation, it is not always a bad thing. I think journalism, as we all know, isn't a vocational area of study. Sure, you can go to J school and you can have a degree in journalism, but you don't need an education, a formal education to become a journalist in the same way you need a formal education to become a lawyer or a doctor. And so that lack of barrier of entry isn't always a negative thing. It's quite good to have arenas in which conversations can be had quite openly and fully. However, when you cosplay or when you market yourself as a journalist, or if you market what you do as journalism, then it is subject to standard and to an objective truth. And so with the coming of opinion media, there is, with that benefit, also the downside, which is people being able to share information. And we all, as journalists, as people who consume information too, know how important that is. And there is an obligation you have to have when you're in any position of power, whether it's absolute or relative, to do right by the power of journalism and do right by the power of information. But that is exactly how authoritarian regimes and organizations are able to benefit from opinion media, because it doesn't actually hold itself to a level of standard which subscribes and insists on objective truth.
Thank you.
In Russia, main problem that we have is a problem with propaganda, and as you can imagine, and now it turns into that the most of Russians, they don't want to believe in war, and they don't want to agree with that situation, just because the propaganda works very well, and it's very effective. And of course, it's kind of we know that 70% of Russians, they have watched TV, and we don't have an independent TV and TV stations, and it's all about propaganda. And well, those who don't have any options about TV, they create now a new standalone media in small blogs and small in social media, and they use it as an instrument of propaganda. Telegram, they have special blogs with war correspondents who write about war only from government side, and this is a big problem now. So yeah, it's a kind of it helps the authoritarian regime.
In Afghanistan, the main problem now is that independent journalists are not allowed to work and operate on the ground, and that all media outlets has received guidance from the Taliban, and they cannot write anything against that, otherwise they will be punished. But the Taliban has taken over the government media outlets and other outlets that they have influence over. And when Facebook decided to shut down the Taliban run national television, they start complaining about the Facebook not respecting the freedom of speech, but in the meantime, the Taliban doesn't have any respect for that. But the only information which is coming out of a media outlet is the information that the Taliban wants, and it's in their favor.
Yeah, and I'd just add, opinion reporting, I don't think on its face is all bad, but, when it's packaged as if it's this, neutral, unbiased journalism, it can prey on people who, my job every day is to read the news. Not everyone does that, and it preys on these deficits, I think, in media literacy that are out there. I think it's really important that, as a general public, we learn how to read media reports and news reporting with a critical eye, but the reality is we're not, quite there yet. So I think opinion reporting can get exploited to that end, and by these more authoritarian-minded regimes, and to further their own agendas, and with propaganda or with disinformation narratives, and it can be really dangerous.
Thank you. That actually segues pretty nicely into my next question. In the last few years, press freedom worldwide, sorry, hold on. I realize I just hopped into the next one. In the next few years, press freedom worldwide has dramatically deteriorated, with more journalists being attacked and information increasingly suppressed by governments. What are some warning signs for press freedom in hybrid regimes or democracies that are struggling with things like media literacy?
So I can start. I have a lot of experience. So the first signs, they started to fire people, just big bosses in media who journalist leaders who, for example, my ex-boss, he worked in a few media outlets, and he lead the investigative department. And the government just pressed on the owner of this media, and they fired them twice, like from one media, from one newspaper, then from another newspaper. So it starts from signs like that. And then, very slowly but very successfully, they just started to press owners. And for example, more than 3 years ago, we had a law in Russia that actually you can't now be an owner of media in Russia. We have a law about 20% of foreign involved. So if you want to help, for example, and to be present in Russia as a media company, you can't do it at all. And it happens, I believe, in media when and you can follow the political situation, how it's like mirror what happens in media. And so I wrote a main page in my newspaper, which when I worked like 5 years ago, I wrote about law about foreign agent. And after a 3 year, law was used against me. I still joke about it after all. And when it happened, our suggestion as a journalist was that they gonna use it against opposition, against non-profit organization, against activists, but they with time they use it against us. And it's also a sign. So in my opinion, any involved from government, it's a bad science, no matter what. Like any, if government want to buy your media, if government want to make law about media, just don't touch it, please. All that I wanted to say that to independent country, don't touch media, please. We can hold it by us. And what else? A lot of science, bad science. I remember I covered story about one of the Putin's guard, and I came to the region, and it was a lot of shadows for me. It was like 5 guys who follow me all these days when I'm having a lot of meetings with sources and so on. And actually, it's also a bad science. If you have shadows, if you have police searching, I mean, it's a bad science. Yeah, I guess.
Thank you.
I think when we're looking at signs, it's definitely that feeling of intervention from the government. So I definitely want to echo what Olga has said. But I think it also starts with your audience. I think when you're looking at journalism and the way in which you disseminate it out to the public, one of the first warning signs or the things that make you stand out is your audience. Because when we look at our line of work, usually there's a feeling that you doing it itself is the problem if somebody has an issue with what you're reporting about. But I think it happens later than that, because you can say I have a problem with the journalist, and then you can say I have a problem with the journalist having a platform. But what you actually have a problem with is not even the journalists themselves or the platform they have. You have a problem with the quality of the information they have and whether or not people believe them. And I think when you have an engaged audience who believe in what you are saying, that is when and it sounds so awful to say because that's when you should be celebrating as a journalist. But in certain countries, in Nigeria, for example, and I can imagine in Russia and in Afghanistan too, when you have a growing and engaged audience, that is when alarm bells start going off for other people. So then you have a heightened sense of people watching what you're saying, fact checking first and foremost, which is a good thing. But also, then you have the issues with pressures, then you have warnings. Going back to NSARS, Arise News, as I said, is a small network compared to the bigger networks in Nigeria. But off the back of our coverage of the NSARS protest, we definitely have become a household name. But in our coverage of the protests and the memorial protests, the network was fined millions of naira. And while it isn't the biggest issue, when you look at how the network is able to run, it still shows that there is a level of pushback there when you are doing something, when you have an audience that someone else is threatened by. So it's definitely the fines that we've experienced, it's the demands of perhaps government officials wanting to make sure the way in which you tell the news is their type of objective. Very rarely will you have someone in a position of power, a politician, even a president. The president of Nigeria called the leader of the Arise Network on the 20th of October 2021 at the memorial protest because it was unfiltered coverage. We were live on every corner. We were a very small team, but you could see the police beating people up. You saw the police beat us up. You saw the police spray pepper spray in people's eyes, throw them into the back of lorries, beat them. And to have that unadulterated, unfiltered truth is difficult for people to consume. So usually, or not even usually, it's wise to be aware that it's not always about somebody thinking that you're telling a lie. It's about them wanting you to tell a story the way they interpret it. So I think one of the warning signs, or the warning signs, as my colleagues has already said, are definitely the warnings of people wanting you to change your type of coverage, fines, demands, and definitely threats.
I would say if all journalists are not enjoying the same type of freedom, it's a sign that the government or the ruling regime has influence over it, and they want to tell the story the way they expect it to be. With the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, some of the journalists were given the opportunities to travel to other provinces and cover whatever stories they wanted. And there were many experienced journalists who went on Twitter and started writing that they feel very safe in Kabul and all parts of the country, and they enjoy the freedom they have. But soon it changed, and stories that it needed to be covered. So I would say the first sign is if the same freedom is not there for everyone. And also, as Olga said, if the government started guiding journalists or like leading them or providing them principles, then
public attacks on journalists would, people may use as an offhand remark or something like that. It does have the effect of normalizing a culture of attacking journalists. It's bringing light to people who do this thing. We've done a lot of research on playing out on social media, what we term online violence, and journalists really do take a lot of online violence on social media, and it's especially women journalists and especially journalists of color, and it can increasingly, like, the digital world isn't separate from the real, the physical world. This stuff spills offline. So that was January 6th. I think in terms of warning signs, what may seem kind of harmless offhand remarks, maybe try to be excused as that, really can just be like a really dangerous first step toward normalizing this kind of dangerous environment where it can really get a lot more intense.
Great, thank you. Is the audio still?
You can try, see if,
Sharif, do you have any comments on this question, or do you want me to repeat it? Hopefully we can hear you.
I think if you can hear me, I can try and give it an answer. Can you hear me fine?
Sorry, it's still not quite working. We'll try to come back to you.
Sure.
Moving on to our next question. Despite the government's attempts to suppress the spread of information about the protests that sprung up after the death of Mahsa Amini, social media has been incredibly successful in conveying information both within and outside of Iran. In what ways has reporting through social media, Twitter, Instagram, etc., positively and negatively impacted populations living under authoritarian regimes?
I want to answer this because so in Iran and in Afghanistan, it's impossible for free press to cover incidents, and we are heavily relied on social media, and we try to get information through that. But there are a couple of problems with that. First, when we are publishing the images from social media, we pose a great risk to those who capture those images, and if they're identified, they would be in a great risk. And secondly, sometimes it can be misleading, and the information, we could be just like a loudspeaker for the person who is sharing the images, and it happened in many cases that we relied on information from social media, and later on we realized that it was not accurate, or it was in favor of the ruling regime or the government. So it has its pros and cons, but in situations like Afghanistan and Iran, I think it's the only option that we have to cover and get information.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have the same situation in Russia because all independent journalists now enrolled. It's more than 500 journalists, I believe, according to it was like a few months ago, maybe more. And for us, it's the only options to stay in connect with what happens in Russia now. And of course, you have to check everything that you see there. But for example, a few weeks ago, it was a mobilization, and all news that we find out from social media, from Instagram, from our.
I think we're about to get audio though, by the way. 1 second. Okay. You can keep talking.
Yeah, so it's the only options to stay in touch what's happened there. And the thank God that our friends now can use VPN because Instagram is illegal in Russia and they banned all Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and my friends, they teach their grannies how to use VPN in Russia now because it's the only options to stay in touch. So yeah, it helps, but you should check it very strongly.
Thank you.
Can you ask Sharif if he can, I muted myself here.
To see if you can unmute.
Yeah. Unmute there and ask if he can speak. Do you want to unmute on your
I can
computer?
unmute.
No, you can ask. Ask Sharif to speak.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. I'd say just quickly on the question about warning signs. At CPJ, we've been there for 10 years, and most of the time we were struggling to fight back against the crackdown and the counter-revolutions that happened after the Arab Spring 10 years ago. And some of the worrying signs we've seen that continues to escalate until today, including phenomena like shutting down internet completely, which used to be a rare sight 10 years ago, but it's now much more common worldwide. We see it played out now in Iran, and I think Iran still holds the record for how they have shut down continuously the internet a few years ago. Another worrying sign, which also started 10 years ago and continues to be one of the rising threats, is transnational assaults. These are basically attempts by governments to silence critics outside of their borders, including those who live in Western and democratic countries. And some of these take the form of spyware, surveillance attacks that basically take over your phones, the journalists' phones, reaches their families, their sources, but even world leaders, as we saw with the Pegasus software and the project that showed last year more than 180 journalists were tracked and surveilled, and many of world leaders as well. There are a lot of signs that has to do specifically with my region, where a lot of dictatorship and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. I would just say one of them, because we have an Al Jazeera journalist, or someone worked with Al Jazeera, was more recently, once Al Jazeera is under attack, you think that this democratic transition is going in the wrong direction. We saw that happen in Egypt, but all across the region, more recently in Tunisia, one of the countries that have had some success in the Arab Spring, but also in Sudan, where a lot of the people continue to resist military power. I'm gonna just say, while before we go to another question, in the Middle East is also one of the most censored countries worldwide, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also one of the worst jailers of journalists, including Egypt, Saudi, Iran, Bahrain. But the most, I think, important statistic is one of every 3 journalists who've died worldwide in the last 10 years died on the job in the Middle East. I'll stop here and try to answer other questions later. Thank you for trying.
Thank you. Would anyone like to either respond to what he said or go back to the question about social media?
It's kind of, a double-edged sword in social media. It seems like there's maybe this relation had some really
Mute that one.
Okay.
If the lectern, and keep the lectern on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just like this?
So yeah, and I think you see just disinformation, and I think it's impossible to kind of disentangle disinformation from authoritarian backsliding. You just see it really circulate unchecked on social media platforms. I think Facebook's probably the most notable one, but I think in different countries, different regions, it's different social media or messaging apps. I know in Brazil, they're about to have the second round of their elections, and disinformation is just rampant on WhatsApp there. And so yes, I would say, it is this double-edged sword, and I think also just as importantly, and increasingly so, in light of these internet shutdowns that you see in these authoritarian countries, like there is technology being developed and out there to enable people to continue to access these information. Which I know spiked in Russia, I believe, its use spiked in Russia since the start of the invasion, and I know it's widely used in Iran as well. I think we recently were looking at what the protests in Iran, and people are using Bluetooth technology to communicate with one another. They're using satellite technology to continue to access the internet. So I think there's the need to embrace technology as authoritarian crackdowns happen, while also being mindful of their uses and how they can be exploited as well.
Absolutely. I mean, just to echo what my colleagues have said, I think social media is such a powerful, and I do think it is an inherently positive tool when it comes to sharing and the spreading of information. Absolutely. There are problems because of the lack of checks and balances in there. You can literally post anything, you can literally say anything, and there often isn't any independent body there to verify what's been said, to provide a timestamp to a video, to provide context to a tweet. It is quite difficult, but it is a positive thing, and I think that when I look at Nigeria specifically, Nigeria banned Twitter for 6 months. Because Twitter had deleted a tweet sent by Muhammadu Buhari, who is the president. And that's just an example of how, the government can see the power social media plays and clearly have flexed their own powers in a negative way. But that didn't stop Nigerians from using Twitter. As Olga said, people quite openly and freely use VPNs until the ban was lifted a few months ago. But it does show that I think that the way media modernizes over time, that rate of modernization seems to be happening at a far increased pace than any level of independent body or form that seeks to verify what you're seeing. So I think that we all have a responsibility to share information that we can verify and that we know is objectively true. But then again, it is quite difficult to understand and know what is true and what's not true, especially when something major is happening, like what we're seeing in Iran, or what happened on January 6th in the United States, or what happened on October 20th in Nigeria. Sometimes there isn't the time to do that when you just want to share what you've seen or tell people, alert them to something that's happening. So it is quite a difficult and multifaceted issue, but I do think that social media itself is a positive thing for people to have, to share information, and I think it's a good thing for journalism. And unfortunately, in certain parts of the world where media literacy isn't very strong, you see the bad side of social media, especially on WhatsApp. When it comes to chain mail or broadcast messages, they travel quite far, especially in Nigeria. WhatsApp messages travel very far, and people believe what they're reading without having any type of second thought or critical mind when they're looking at the type of content they're consuming. So I do think, just to wrap up, it is a good thing, but we should be aware of how to use it properly.
Great, thank you. Sharif, did you want to comment on this question at all? We can move on. We're running out of time a little bit. So Last question for the panelists before we'll open it up to all of you. How do you weigh risks and keep yourself safe while reporting in dangerous and/or repressive environments?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
the
bush. I wasn't hearing you.
And then. Okay. It's ask. Did he talk? Yeah, we can hear you.
I think he said he didn't hear the question.
Oh,
Oh.
okay. I can repeat it if you'd like.
I'll type it.
Or should we just keep going?
Can he hear us?
I can't hear you.
Turn that on. It's gonna Let me know the question.
Okay. Despite the Iranian government's attempt to suppress the spread of information about the protests.
I'll just ask.
Okay, just ask about social media's role in positives and negatives of authoritarian.
Okay, you can go on with the next.
So back to the last question. How do you weigh risks and keep yourself safe while reporting in dangerous
The short answer would be there is no way. If you started your career in Russia as a journalist, you're probably insane already. And but if you're talking seriously, you have to take care about yourself. And as I mentioned previously, when I covered one story about Putin's governor, and I was in region, and five big guys follow me, and I went to the toilet, and I was so nervous that like my hands are shaking, and I broke the zipper on my pants, and I was like, okay, this is a stupid situation because you would be arrested immediately, and you don't have any extra pants. It's really stupid. And but I had the therapist already, and I say to me like, okay, calm down, go outside and smile to them, and everything will be okay. And it was like that. I go outside, smile to them, and they smiled actually to me too, and we was like, hi, have a nice day, guys. So to take care about yourself, it's very important if you're living under the pressure in authoritarian countries. And it would be my first answer. And the next, it's you have to prepare yourself, and you have to keep in touch with the lawyers who actually are the only helpers in these situations, because society would not help. And they don't want to help us at all, and they have a lot of other problems, they absolutely uninvolved. So when it happens, you have to be alone with your problems, you and your colleagues and your lawyers and your extra pants. And
Thank you.
In terms of dangerous environments, I would say you should have all the safety gears and always wear a helmet, body armor, and should have proper knowledge of the environment or the battlefield you are going to cover. And if not, have someone who have the knowledge, and also always have a B plan if something happens. Have a backup plan for an ambulance if a road's wrong or something, or you got injured. Yeah, it's a great risk, but you should calculate it when you're working in dangerous.
I think Sharif is ready to respond. 1 second.
Try. The issue of safety and how journalists weigh in the risk, of course, is related in some ways to preparation ahead of time, but also with a few principles safety principles, and one of them is we tell journalists there isn't a story worth dying for, basically. And there is also issues that has to do with what kind of journalist, what kind of support, what kind of training they have, because it matters a lot when planning for these issues. One of the most important vulnerability is that, especially in areas of conflict, a lot of the first responders are local journalists. Many of them are not trained or do not have the support of an outlet behind them, because what the Arab Spring have shown, and what has now became a phenomenon all over the world, is that anyone with an internet connection and a cell phone can be a journalist, can be a source for a journalist or a photographer to help tell the story. So a lot of those preparations usually are not taken, and trainings are not taken. But there are standards that are now part of a lot of newsrooms, global news organizations that we at CPJ and other partners have tried to build a consensus on, including making sure that even if it was a freelance or a local contractor, someone or even a fixer is considered in terms of the planning for safety, preparations including providing tools, first aid, vests in some cases, but also hostile environment trainings that help them weigh in those risks ahead of time. And there are other preparations that they and their editors they can go through, including making sure they have a plan, they have discussed privacy and other issues in case something goes wrong. These and others are resources that are available, thankfully, in many languages that can be deployed in, when there is a need or risk to be assessed. Thank you.
I think that advice is sound and it's accurate and it's good. Because truly there is no story worth dying for, but there are stories that are worth telling. And it's up to the journalists to discern how far they want to go. But I also want to make clear that sometimes it's not as easy as just being careful. Sometimes you can have the right equipment. Sometimes you can have the right team. Sometimes you can have cameras rolling and you can still be hurt. Shireen Abu Akleh, who was an Al Jazeera journalist, an American-Palestinian journalist, was shot and killed in the line of duty. She was adequately dressed. She had a helmet, she had a bulletproof vest, and she was still killed. So sometimes you just can't control your environment. What is your alternative? To not go to work? To not report the news? Some journalists, that's just not a choice they're willing to make. That's not a sacrifice that they want to make. And that doesn't make them foolish, or it doesn't make them reckless. It makes them committed, and they aren't the problem. The people who are holding up guns or threatening you or beating you or censoring you, they are the problem. And it's really difficult because everything my colleagues have said is correct. You can be wise and know what stories are worth telling, protect yourself with information, with actual gear, but sometimes it's not good enough, and sometimes that's just a risk you're going to take. When I decided I wanted to be a journalist, I made a joke and said, never covering war, absolutely not covering any type of healthcare pandemic, just tell my stories and go home. And oftentimes, you don't control the news. You don't control world events. They just happen, and then you just tell them. So it's we're always in quite a difficult position. Many people have families that they need to get back home to. But at the same time, many people see the fantastic work that journalism serves. They see the positive aspects in journalism, how powerful it is, how important it is, and they choose to continue to do that. And I think the great thing about journalists and brave journalists is that they are always going to do their job, even in the face of people with your life, they're always going to do their job. It's not ideal, but that's just our lot as journalists, I think.
The only thing I'd add is that I think there's just real power in when journalists collaborate with one another across newsrooms or freelancers, collaborating with other freelancers. Not only does it, expand the scope of what you're able to report on, but it can also act as a deterrent to other if you're being targeted potentially for your reporting, because if you're going to be targeted for that, there might be 10 other journals who will publish their reporting anyway. So what's the point? Yeah, I was able to speak. There's a really impressive Czech journalist. Her name is Pavla Holcova, who she put out she led an investigation that took down the Slovakian government, and that was her kind of top line advice when she spoke with me that she had for other journalists.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for answering all of my questions. And now, if you guys have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll point to you. Try to project. There's a lack of microphones in this room. And then, just as a reminder, please direct your questions at one of the panelists and try to keep it under a minute. Thank you.
Oh, don't all rush.
In terms of propaganda specific for Olga, specifically for Russia, do you have a sense of why it's so effective in Russia? You kind of mentioned that there's some level of VPN usage, so some people are getting other perspectives, but why it's so effective there as opposed to, say, if it is or not effective in sort of neighboring countries in that sort of sphere of influence?
Good question. Because it was a long work, like 20 years, they actually killed all others' voices. And when you are like normal citizen who lived in someone in Siberia, who actually don't like to read a lot of news, who actually used only TV for the sources, for information, you have no choice and you just follow the major line and that's all. And people are people everywhere, and actually that's something that we saw in America, the same situation. They believe in like some theory and which is insane, that that COVID doesn't exist and so on. And it's just because they decided to watch this particular media. And it's really strong. You have to understand that it's a good job. I believe that one day I would see all of these propagandist journalists on the national tribunal, on the international tribunal, and they would be arrested someday because it's a kind of their role in this war are the biggest. It's a very I don't know. It hurts me so much because we have independent media, but now, because of the people who works for the government, who works with propaganda, we all should live abroad. We all covered from abroad, and that was his work. And I don't want to blame people because it's just every day they decided what to eat. And they don't have a well education and so on. They don't have a lot of privileges. So it's we have what we have.
Thank you all so much for speaking this morning. I apologize, my questions also fall, but I couldn't see it to line up like that. But as you were talking about how effective the propaganda is in Russia and how little power independent media stations have, could you talk a bit about how your work has changed being a journalist outside of Russia and if that has impacted your audience and how you connect with people who are still in Russia?
It's dramatically changed because I couldn't imagine how it was difficult to follow the line from abroad because we all travel a lot and we all was abroad, but kind of to find the stories from abroad to cover it, it's dramatically difficult. For example, my colleagues from TV radio channels, the main problem now is how to film people abroad, because everyone afraid to film it, and people afraid to talk. And now more than ever, like for these 10 years, they're afraid to talk, they're afraid to film, and it's actually kind of funny because my colleagues, they started to film people using the guys who actually filmed weddings, because everybody else, they was abroad already, so they can't film because they were in other countries. So they start using these guys who actually filmed wedding, and it's actually a man. It's always a man. And when the mobilization started, they all like, okay, bye. And now it's a big challenge just to find people who will be filmed, your heroes abroad, and I don't know. And actually, it's very difficult to be in touch with your people, how they feel, what they want, because it's a big line between us and them. You know, I have this privilege to be there, and I could save myself and so on, but others not. They have families, they have relatives, and the fear is like poison them. It's a big problem. So what else? I could talk like whole evening, sorry, about it. Yeah, I think the main problem is that I don't know when I could come back. Yeah, it's the main problem. And for me, because I love Russia, I want to write about Russia, and I want to make investigative stories about Russia, and it's kind of useless from America to do it from America, I mean. And we don't know when it stopped. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a question for Adefemi. Thank you so much for coming to speak. My question is, how do you think reporting under authoritarian regime changes depending on your gender too? And how do you see that giving you access or preventing you access from different spaces?
It's two things. It's an advantage and a disadvantage. It's an advantage because Nigeria is such a patriarchal country and society that even if they see a woman reporting or telling the news, they almost don't hear what you're saying. You almost don't exist. And when you don't exist, you're less likely to be a threat. So in that context, it's an advantage. But it's also a disadvantage because you can see me, you can hear my voice, I know what I'm saying, I know what I'm doing, I do exist. And when you are working in any type of arena, but especially in journalism in Nigeria, it's a difficult one because they see your gender first. And when they see your gender first, that dictates the amount of attention they're going to give you, the type of attention they're going to give you. It will be more women than men that will be accosted when they are putting a microphone in the face of a politician. Oh, you're so tall, you're so fine, you're so pretty. Never really hear men being, complimented when they're asking somebody a question. But that's something that you have to take as a journalist, as a woman working in Nigeria. But when I look at what happens at the memorial at NSARS, they rough-handled me like, I was a man too. And that is difficult to them because I think the idea is, well, if you want to be brave like a man, we'll treat you like one. And that's difficult too. So it's quite a nuanced issue to be a part of in Nigeria, because when you're looking at women, no matter how advanced society may be, because there are fantastic Nigerian women who, whether or not they're educated, whether or not they're famous, who do real and good work. But that is almost always underpinned by your gender. So if you are an esteemed journalist, for example, well, that's good for her, but is she married? Does she have children? And if she doesn't, she can't live a fulfilled life. But then perhaps if you are committed to a domestic lifestyle, then you aren't really an independent and a modern woman because you don't have work outside of, your proximity to a man or a husband. It's a very difficult landscape to navigate, but you navigate it all the same. And just showing up changes an opinion. You responding to somebody making a joke about your question or complimenting the way you look when you've asked them a serious question, you ignore it and you focus on what you're there to do. And that hopefully it teaches them that the next time, or maybe I won't pass a compliment to this woman, perhaps she's a bit too saucy. And hopefully little by little you change it, but it is quite difficult. Positive in one sense that you're not really seen as a target, but also you can be if you're tall like me and mouthy like me.
Thank you. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my question is to, can you hear me? Okay. My question is to Ola and Fahim. Most probably, two of you will end up covering Russia and Afghanistan from outside, which is unfortunate. So, what kind of impact can you make in the democratic process in your respective countries by covering it from outside?
Great question. Actually, I want to have three questions on this, but yeah.
So it's kind of a new feelings for me that now we provide some sort of support to our listeners and readers, just because.
Louder.
Okay. It's a new feelings for me that we provide a new level of. It was just a news for me. I mean, it was a big news. It was cool stories. It was investigative articles and so on. But now it's a kind of support to our audience because they felt alone. You know, our audience it's mostly well-educated and younger people who can't be outside. They want to continue in the education. They have, as I mentioned, they have a job. They have a relative, and they want to be there. And they feel very lonely there because you have your relatives who believe in propaganda. You have a Russian television, and that's all that you have. And our process is like science that you are not alone. You are normal. Everything normal. So I don't know. Can we consider this as impact? But I believe that at least I could help to someone.
I think we can make very little impact, but it is just to give a sense for the people and for our audience that we didn't forget them. And like we write their stories and we try to be their voice and the world should pay attention. Because for the Taliban, if it is anything, if it's not in their interest, it's a propaganda, and then they won't consider it. But for people who are living under the Taliban and they don't have any other choice, it's a hope for them that their stories have been told, and maybe the world and the international community will take some measures which can affect their life.
Hi, I am Sheikh Sabiha Alam. I'm a Dhaka-based journalist from Bangladesh. And in fact, I want to share my experience, and I would like to get an observation from my friend Adi Femi. Like you were talking about the security gears that we use in situations, but I want to share my experience. Like my WhatsApp was hacked once. My source in the intelligence agency was grilled for sharing sensitive information with me. My conversation with my father on a sensitive issue got leaked. And in fact, those safety gears didn't come into any use. And also, our parliament has passed a law. It's called Digital Security Act. And it's being used indiscriminately against the journalists who writes anything about any person from the ruling party. So they are in a bad situation. And in this situation, in areas where the country is governed by authoritarian rulers, do you think that unity of news outlets are important, and also the responsibility lies with the journalists too, so that they can never be used as tools of the government, because we have seen so many pro-government news agencies coming up every day. What to do, sir? Thank you.
Thank you, Sabiha. I agree that I do think that yes, unity amongst journalists is important, and unity amongst different networks is important, but it's rare because networks have different agendas, they align with different people. So it's going to be, if you use Nigeria as an example, it's going to be very difficult for networks, actual channels or newspapers or podcasts to align with each other in an ideal way, because they have differing agendas and ways in which they want to go ahead to the media. They're also in competition with each other. So that makes it even more difficult to unify. But I think the journalists within the news networks can definitely connect with themselves. There have been many instances where journalists, myself, have gone through a negative experience at work and have been supported by people in other networks. So it definitely does exist. But I think that when it comes to actual networks themselves coming together and unionizing in this way, it would be wonderful, but I don't think it's possible, not just yet. And in terms of journalists having the responsibility to do right by their jobs, again, too, it's very easier said than done. In Nigeria, there's a term called a brown envelope journalist. And brown envelopes are literally, those small envelopes filled with money that perhaps somebody would give a journalist, maybe a politician would give a journalist, or if you've called them to cover the opening of a hotel or something, you'd give a brown envelope to a journalist. And that obviously is not a good thing. But that speaks to the bigger issue of economics and whether or not people can actually afford to be journalists. I think quite around the world, journalism isn't a place where you get rich, unfortunately. So it's very easy to fall prey to those types of situations. And then when you do accept someone's money, there is an expectation of loyalty. So then your journalistic integrity and your ethics are now being bruised because of your economic situation. And it's very difficult, actually. Even outside of Nigeria, I was born and raised in London, and I say this all of the time whenever I'm on panels, that the journalism space in the United Kingdom is very white and very upper middle class. By its very definition, it seeks to gatekeep an industry and keep people who don't meet or fall into those demographics out of that industry. And it works. It does work because people aren't earning enough to comfortably tell journalism or report journalism or be a journalist in the way that they had hoped to be. So that needs to change. The ecosystem around our line of work has to change. Not that journalists have to become millionaires, but there has to be a level of respect. And it's tough. It's very, very tough, because when you have a level of integrity, money is supposed to come way after that. No, you're supposed to go to that story. You're supposed to travel to that place and tell that story because you have a desire to do it. You have a responsibility to do it. But damn, how am I going to pay to get there? How am I going to feed my kids when I get home? What am I going to do if I can't make rent? Or what if I actually want to own a house? It's such a difficult situation to be in. And that's why you have to first and foremost speak out when you're in positions of privilege and try your hardest to make situations where journalism is an industry, an occupation that people can not only just be proud of because of the title, but they can be comfortable in. You can say no to something because you can actually say no to it. Sometimes when people become brown envelope journalists, it's not because they lack morals or because they're bad people. Sometimes you're just hard on choice. And I always say the ultimate luxury in life is to have good choices. When you have bad choices or no choice at all, that's when the problem starts. So yes, to answer your question directly, Sabiha, absolutely, journalists have a responsibility to be impartial, especially to the government, but it's difficult to do that when you don't have anyone.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so sorry first.
I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I'm from Istanbul, Turkey, and I was in Istanbul during the coup attempt, and I remember my mom waking me up in the middle of the night trying to explain things. So I wanted to hear more about your emotions and thoughts, specifically about that event. And also, I want to hear more about your journalism experience in Turkey with regards to the current level of freedom of journalism in Turkey.
Thank you very much. Well, first, I like to say that Turkey was actually a good part of my career. I was still very, very young. I like to think I'm still a young lady now, but I was very, very young back then. And I was very, very excited to be in Turkey and to be at the forefront of this new startup that was supposed to change the world, like so they told us. The night of the coup attempt, I wasn't at work. And my friends who were at work, when I speak to them about their experience of hearing the glass shatter, because the military, they came on air, they came into the studios and took people out of their seats and told them to leave, took their phones and all of that stuff. That was scary. It was different. But I think you as a Turkish person would know that even though the coup was put down before dawn, it's something that people still remember. People still died. It's tough because when you look at what happened in Turkey that day and what's happened ever since, there's been the level of democracy in Turkey is worsening, unfortunately. And many people, when you go back to the coup attempt, some people will definitely say, of course, it was a coup to put down the AK party or to hurt Erdogan. And there are other people who say that perhaps Erdogan played a role in it too. Perhaps it was some underhanded attempt to censor the media and keep them under wraps. And that's still something that many people, many journalists in Turkey are battling with. But when I look at my own experience in just knowing what it was like being there at that time and then staying for about a year and a half afterwards, it was quite difficult. I think one thing I really did like was the level of patriotism people had. It was quite magical to see people go out onto the streets that night and actually fight against the military. Some paid with their lives, unfortunately. But it was such a historic moment to see how many Turkish flags there were and still were weeks and months after that coup attempt. The Bosphorus Bridge is now being called the July 15th Bridge in honor of the people who lost their lives during that coup attempt. And I think that Turkey still has a lot of potential to not only improve its level of democracy, but also improve its level of press freedom in the country. There is quite a long way to go. Even when I was in Istanbul, it felt very much with us or against us. You are aligning with the AKP and everything to do with Turkish radio television, or you are part of the FETÖ organization and you are with the enemies. And it's hard to have independent voices, even though they do exist in Turkey. Clearly they are suppressed and censored, and we can only hope that over time the landscape when it comes to journalism in Turkey evens out a bit so that there can be voices. If people do align themselves willfully with the AKP, they should be free to do that, and if you do not, you can and should be able to openly voice that without fear of retribution or anything else.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here tonight and for discussing these really important issues, and to our audience for your great questions and helping us through some technical issues. You're all welcome to join us outside for refreshments from Noor. It's super good if you're hungry, but please join. Thank you. We have more panels tomorrow and Saturday. Tomorrow we have journalism in an era of misinformation and disinformation. So if you're interested in the social media parts of this discussion, I would recommend going to that. And then Saturday we've got a coffee conversation about covering Afghanistan with Christina Goldbaum. and that is at 9:30 in Barnum. And then there's 2 more panels that day, chronicling war and occupation at 10 a.m. also in Barnum, and women in journalism around the world at 11:30. So please come join us for all of those. We'd love to see you.
Thank you very much.
Kind of.
You know,
Oh, you got my thing.